Hello, everybody. The nice people in the green shirts at the back asked me to remind you to turn off any sound-making devices like cell phones. So hello, my name is Bronwen Grimes. I'm a technical artist at Valve. And today I'd like to share with you some of the shader techniques that we used in Left 4 Dead 2 that helped us save memory, produce our content on time, and even solve gameplay problems. Left 4 Dead 2 is a cooperative first-person shooter set in the American South during the immediate aftermath of the zombie apocalypse. It shipped in November of 2009, exactly a year after the release of the first Left 4 Dead. We had an extremely successful launch, selling over 2 million units in our first 2 weeks after release. On top of that, we picked up a number of awards, including Spike TV's VGA for Best Xbox 360 Game. We accomplished all of this doing something that Valve has never even attempted before, and that's shipping a sequel to a game inside of a single year. Our target for Left 4 Dead 2 was exactly the same as Left 4 Dead 1. It was the Xbox 360 and the PC. I'm going to focus more on the Xbox 360 just because in terms of percentages of hardware configurations, the Xbox 360 presents our largest uniform target. So when I say things like fit in memory, I mean fit in memory on Xbox 360. In the first Left 4 Dead, we had 5 high-resolution boss characters that can appear absolutely anywhere in the game, so we always had to take them into account when we were considering memory budgets. In Left 4 Dead 2, on top of updating the look of those 5, we wanted to add 4 more. Our maps are 30% longer than they were in the first Left 4 Dead, which means that we're going to be spending more memory on environment assets. In the first Left 4 Dead, we had 5,600 lines of dialogue. In Left 4 Dead 2, we had over 7,800, so that's a 40% increase. We wanted to add new guns, more guns, and an entirely new class of weapons, and that's the melee weapons. So with the melee weapons and the boss characters going into the game, we obviously need to support those systems by including more animation data and adding more effects. So with all of this stuff going into the game, and we've already run into memory limits on the first Left 4 Dead, the question becomes, how can we do more with less? We wanted to focus only on high-impact systems because we had a year to do all of our production for Left 4 Dead 2. Because it's a zombie shooter, anything that we can do to improve the experience of killing zombies is going to be a great investment. So there's 2 systems that fit both that criteria and our topic for today, which is shader techniques, and that's the Horde variation system and the wound system. We're lucky to be creating a sequel because we have so much data from the first game. Not only do we have just experience working with the assets so that we know what was expensive and difficult to author, but we also have playtest logs, both from observation and from interviewing our playtesters, and there's just a huge amount of data that we can mine there. As I go through these examples, what I'll do is I'll start with what we had for Left 4 Dead 1, and then I can go over what we learned from that because we had all that playtest data. The Horde represents pretty much the baseline experience for the Left 4 Dead franchise. They can appear anywhere in the game. You know, there's just a ton of them. We call them the common infected, and we call them common for a reason, because they're all over. We have players kill typically 2,000 of these in a campaign. So 4 players can kill 2,000 infected. We have a goal for Left 4 Dead 2 as well as for Left 4 Dead 1, and that's that we want the players to feel nearly overwhelmed by the enemy during crescendo moments and during finales. And so the last thing that we want is for them to feel nearly overwhelmed by a crowd of obvious clones. So in Left 4 Dead 1, we'd asked our playtesters as they were coming out of their playtests what they felt about the variation of the Horde, and if they could remember for us specific variants. And their answers usually looked something like this. They'd remember the cop, they'd remember the girl, the t-shirt guy, and the old guy. Now, the cop is actually what we call local flavor. He only appears in some areas of the game, so the fact that people recognized him is actually something of a success. But the rest of these guys are supposed to be like extras. They're supposed to be visible but unmemorable. So the fact that they were being remembered as specific variants is not a good sign. We'd relied most of all on texture variation for creating variation. We would generate a single head mesh and then create 4 textures for it and swap between them randomly. Later on during the process, we realized that we were sort of shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit, and what we should be doing is also sharing the individual head textures across different geometry variations. Because we were trying to shoehorn this in a little bit late, not all of the variants were successful, and so we didn't get as much mileage out of the system as we could have if we designed it from the ground up. For the bodies, we didn't have any texture variants at all. There was just a single texture for each body type. We tried to get more variation out of this by adding tinting to them. As you can see in the first example there with a bit of a gray shirt, that's actually the guy that's untinted. And the reason that he's gray instead of something like white is because we want the details to stand out properly under all tinting conditions. And so that means that the light details need to stand out as well as the dark details. So by choosing multiplication as a tinting method, we were limiting the range of luminosity that we could get out of these guys. We had to start a little bit on the dark side, and we could only get darker from there. We had a big problem in that the playtesters weren't perceiving all of our variation. They were even seeing guys who were actually authored to be different as clones. So although we had tried to create variation, and though we'd used different techniques for that, it was clear that not everything we were doing was working, so we needed to reassess. We found what didn't work was any type of texture variation that didn't change contrast. I've got 3 examples up there, and you can see how similar they are. Left 4 Dead is an extremely fast-paced game, and so players, if they can't identify immediately that 2 guys are different, they're never going to get the chance to go and scrutinize them and figure it out. We need to make broad-scale changes. Fine detail of any sort isn't going to help us. The guy in the middle there actually has a mustache. I don't know if anybody could even notice that, but it's there. What did work was any geometry variation that changed the proportions of the bodies or the heads or moved features around. So this is actually more successful than the previous example, and it's using the same texture just on 2 different head varieties. What was also really successful is anything that changed the large color shapes of 2 different characters. I'm going to borrow a term from painting, and that's color blocking. So when you're doing a painting, one of the methods you can use for an underpainting is just to paint splotches of color that are the local color for different objects. And then you paint all the detail and shading on top of that, and that's color blocking. So to apply that to a character in the game, what we can do is figure out what they look like from a distance or squint, or if you're me, just take your glasses off. Let's take a look at those 2 little thumbnails up there. They look pretty much identical at this distance, but if I blow them up, you can see how little detail is actually present in the second version. But everything that's in there is what we need to understand the color blocking of this character. If we're going to tint characters, anything that we can do to change the contrast between different color blocks is going to be the most successful thing we can do to create variation. And if we're going to create geometric variations, that geometric variations has to also affect the color blocking. Otherwise, it's going to be a waste of memory. So I'm just going to reveal what the fine resolution detail looks like under those color blocks. And you can see that the first 2 guys actually have identical textures. They're just tinted 2 different ways. And that's really what we want to head for. So we'd like to prototype some sort of tinting system. We want to choose an application that's going to be useful to the people who are going to be using the system. We're not going to jump straight into Engine because there's a cost of implementation there. Actually, what we could have done is just jumped straight into Photoshop and fiddled around with some knobs in there to see what was going to get us some variation. And we did do that a little bit at the beginning. But when it came to actually creating a system that was going to generate all of the variation, we wanted to test it on our geometric variations as well as our texture variations, and so that means moving into a 3D application. We wanted to choose something that would be easy for artists to use because they're the ones who are going to be using the end system. So to put them in a familiar environment, we used Maya's InViewport HLSL plugin. We want to start with the biggest effect for the least investment, and that's tinting. It's also the biggest risk because we're putting a lot on the tinting. If it doesn't work out, we're going to be in real trouble, and we're going to need to have some time left over to figure out what to do. So that's what we started with. Someone suggested that we try gradient mapping. Now, we had no idea whether this would be practical, so it's a great thing to try out and make sure that it's going to work. Gradient mapping, you can test it in Photoshop. If you guys aren't familiar with the technique, there's a filter or an adjustment layer that will let you do it. I've got an example image here. We actually only need the luminosity, so let's just desaturate that guy. I have two ramps down at the bottom there. The first one represents all of the colors that could possibly be visible in that image. So they're all just grayscale values. What the gradient mapping is going to do is every single pixel on there that has a specific grayscale value is going to map to the color that's directly underneath it. So let's apply that and see what it looks like. With this technique, we can only get a certain limited range of colors out of it, because if we add too many, we end up with this rainbow ringing horribleness that nobody would want to see in a game. But the advantage that it does have is it fits great with the DXT compression scheme, and that's what we'll be using both on Xbox 360 and on PC. Because we only need a luminosity value, we only need one channel. We can stick it in the alpha channel of our texture, and the reason that's a good idea is because the alpha channel has the most bits out of any of the channels under the DXT compression scheme. So we're going to get the most fidelity out of it. On top of that, it compresses independently of the RGB, and so anything we stick in the RGB is not going to cause artifacts to appear in the compression of the alpha channel. That frees up our RGB for masks for different effects so that we can increase the amount of variation we're getting through other means. Because we don't want to tint the entire character with a single gradient ramp, I mean, you'll end up with the pumpkin guy we had on the last slide, what we'd like to do is mask the skin and the clothing separately so that we can have two different colors for them. So I've just applied a skin gradient there using one gradient ramp, and then clothing using another gradient ramp. We can choose these two independently, and the reason we'd like to do that is so that we can increase even further the variation that we're going to get out of this system. So we can choose ramps that affect the relative contrast between different color blocks of the body. So we can choose a light ramp for the skin and a dark one for the shirt, or vice versa, and increase the visible variation that the player is going to see. In Left 4 Dead 1, I said we had a problem where players were identifying actual different content as clones. It's not that we didn't do anything about that. I'm just showing you kind of our worst case example here. We did end up fixing this. What we did was we used blood splats to differentiate similar textures and added some grime to them. This is still thinking about color blocking, but at a finer level. So we're affecting the color blocking of the faces. In Left 4 Dead 2, we want to get away with a smaller amount of content. I mean, you saw my first slide where I put up all the stuff we're trying to jam into the game, and we were already limited on memory for Left 4 Dead 1, so for Left 4 Dead 2 we have to do something to free it up to make room for our new content. What we'd like to do instead of just getting mileage out of our variants is we'd like to take a texture and make it look as though it's 4 different textures. So we're going to apply blood masking to disguise identical textures. Now, we don't want to spend a lot of memory on masks. I said we're memory limited. This is going to be a theme throughout the entire presentation. So what we can do is we can take these masks and make each of them a quarter size. Just put each one in a quadrant of the image, and then we can store 4 of them in a single channel. It's just showing how it overlaps with the luminosity there. When we reference this in a shader, what we'll do is 2 texture lookups, one at the full size for the luminosity, and then one at a quarter size to choose a blood mask at random. We can do the same thing for the grime. For the blood, we're just going to use a solid color, red, and mask that through. For grime, we don't need to use a solid color. We can actually use a detail texture, and that's going to help us integrate the infected into their environments. So if they're in a rainy environment, we can use a mud texture. If they're in a dry, urban environment, we can use this kind of combo dirt road rash map that looks different if you put it on the cloth or the skin. Or we can use algae in the swamps. And so it's going to help them feel as though they really belong where you're seeing them. This is a screen capture from Maya. Just showing one of our meshes from Left 4 Dead 1 as we were going through and testing this prototype. We distributed this around to people so they could test it out, and then had a meeting about how people felt about how this was going. So the first thing that came out of it was, it's great, we're getting a much better range of luminosity over the different characters than we were getting with the multiplication technique we used in Left 4 Dead 1. The problem is that these guys are still individually a little bit monochrome. You have kind of a single color that mostly goes over the entire clothing of the character. That's not the way clothing works in the real world, obviously, so we're going to need to find some sort of technique to apply different colors to different areas of the cloth. We also found that the blood splats were on the fuzzy side. Because we're using quarter-size masks and then compounding that by DXT compression, we were getting these blurry edges, we were getting these little blocky bits, and the big problem with that is that blood is supposed to be viscous. You should really have these well-defined edges on it. So we needed to find some way to deal with that. We wanted to include specular masking, especially because we weren't using normal maps. Kind of scanning the audience for reactions there. Nobody flinched. I'm kind of surprised. I think I have to explain myself a little bit here. I mean, we're making an Xbox 360 game and we have characters that are not normal mapped. Well, the reason we're doing that is because we are so texture limited. We have to look at these guys, instead of as individuals, we have to look at the Horde as a whole. Because the Horde is more like the entire character than just one variant. If we have to include normal mapping, we're halving our texture budget, which means we can create half the number of variations. And isn't creating variation the whole point of this system? And so that went on the chopping block because we decided that the variation overall was much more important at a product level. As we were discussing the results, somebody brought up a goal we'd had in Left 4 Dead 1. We'd wanted to have some cue that the infected are no longer human. And a really good cue for an animal nature of something is the retro-reflective effect that you get off the tapetum lucidum of an animal in headlights. You see that glow in their eyeballs. We'd kind of gotten halfway there with Left 4 Dead 1, but it was by no means consistent. So it went back on the wish list. So if you guys are keeping count, I'm sure you are, we're up to 6 masks now. So that's, we want a mask for skin, a mask for cloth, a mask for blood, a mask for grime, a mask for specular, a mask for retroreflectivity. I've already said we nixed normal maps. There's no way we're going to have the number of variations just to get some more masks in there. So we need to find a way to fit all 6 of these masks in the 3 channels we have available. We'll start with the cloth and the skin. We have a great advantage with this in that they don't overlap. So what we can do is use an exclusive masking technique where different value ranges represent different effects. That's going to need some illustration, I can tell. So I've just done what's kind of like a levels operation. I've moved the black point for this texture so that anything that's below 128 is going to be completely ignored. Anything that's above it is going to contribute to the skin masking. And this is something that we can do just as easily in the shader as we can do in Photoshop. For the cloth, we'll do exactly the same thing, but we'll invert the texture first. And then ignore anything that was above 128, and you get a mask that looks like this. So the result is you're putting 2 masks into the same channel and getting exactly the same results as before. Now, this only works because these 2 areas never overlap. It's called, well, we call it exclusive masking because you can't have a little bit of cloth and a little bit of skin in the same pixel. They have to be separated. To deal with the rest of them, we're actually just going to pair them up and use the same exclusive masking technique. We'll pair up specularity with detail. We'll pair up blood with retroreflectivity. That one's going to work because anywhere you have blood over top of a retroreflective surface, the reflection characteristic is going to change anyway. And you've seen we're going to do the clothing and the skin tint together. And of course, we're going to store the luminosity in the alpha. So the result is this. It's kind of a Technicolor nightmare. The only bit that's human readable about it is the alpha channel that's on the right side there. But it did let us stick every single one of those masks, including the 4 different blood splats and the 4 different grime masks, into 3 channels. To deal with the fuzziness of the blood, we're going to use a smooth step operation in the shader. So that's the name in the shader. It's a lot like doing a levels operation. You can tell I'm really fond of levels. It's like doing a levels operation in Photoshop. So I actually did this in Photoshop, but the shader does the same thing. So you can see that moving the black point there kind of creeps in the edges, and we get a sharper result. we're losing fidelity, and there's actually even a few blood droplets there that get missed entirely. So you're never going to see exactly what you authored. But the thing is, the end player has no idea what you authored. The only thing that they care about is if it looks good. And so if we get those sharp edges back in, which is really the most important thing of blood on a skin surface, they're going to think that you authored something that's much higher res than you did. We also added in specularity controls, particularly in those blood masked areas, so that we could get some glossier highlights off them. And I said at the beginning that we use the specular masking and the detail in the same channel. That's possible because anywhere the detail is masked in, we can use its alpha channel as the specularity mask. The last thing that we want to do is somehow deal with the monochrome nature of a single infected, get some more color into the clothing. We wanted to try modifying the ranges in the luminosity so that we could have more color variation. And again, that's going to require some explaining. So what I have here is I have one of our textures. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see there's the shirt, and under that is the sleeves. And then in the lower left-hand corner is the pants. They're authored originally in their full luminosity range. What we want to do is map them to the gradient that you can see that has the green and then the blue. What we can do is we can actually push the value range of, say, the pants. We'll push it into the lower half of the range so that it's going to line up with the green. And then for the shirt, we'll push it into the upper half of the range so it lines up with the blue. Let's just play that back and you can see it happening. So the pants get darker, the shirt gets lighter, and then it pauses. Fabulous. Okay. One more time. Oh, come on. You know you want to. Let's get some mouse action in here. Play. Thank you, darling. There we go. There's our lovely result. All right, so the drawback with this technique is all about fidelity. We only have 256 gray values to map into other colors to begin with. So now in the pants, we only have 127. But actually, it ends up being even less than that because we need a buffer range. Oh, come on. Okay. We need a buffer range between the two zones. What happens if we compress this texture is we lose complete control over every single value in the entire luminosity. And so the values that are at the upper end of one range or the lower end of the other range can actually slip over a little bit. And then we end up with, you can see that we've got some artifacts in there, which we obviously want to avoid. And the way to avoid that is putting in a little buffer between the ranges where there are some values that are just unused. So it ends up being 127 values minus 5%. So the more finely we split this range, the more this is going to be a problem. We're going to be losing more to the buffer ranges, and we're also going to be using less values inside of the single area. So using less values means that we're going to run into banding at some point. So we've got to keep that in mind. We also have to check. We can't just split this, 100 times because then it's just going to be, it'll look like the color blocking slide I showed you earlier. So let's take a peek at our results. So this is the second round of the prototype. Apply the blood masking. You can see that really helps differentiate their faces. And then the tinting almost makes them feel like entirely different characters. And if you can imagine these guys flying at you a mile a minute, 30 of them coming at you, you don't have time to necessarily identify that, oh yeah, his collar is exactly the same on all four of those. Because you just don't have time to see that. This is going to be extremely helpful. But we're not even finished. This is just the texture variation. We also need to do geometry variation. What we do is create a bit of an Uber map where we have all of these features that are included in the map, and none of them are going to be on a single infected. An infected is going to pull different bits from it. And the reason that's a good idea, well, for one thing, we don't have to duplicate through different textures areas that are shared, like the thighs on these guys are all the same. But the other thing is that they're going to batch together in the renderer. Because they're sharing the same texture, we don't need to go back to the renderer and reset a bunch of options every time we want to draw these guys. And so the rendering is going to be more efficient. So we make all of our geometric variations together and then unwrap them together because rejigging that texture after you've worked it out is really difficult. So we want to just, do it straight through the first time. We're shipping in a year, guys. We don't have a lot of time to go back and fiddle with these things, so we want to get it right from the beginning. You saw that Technicolor nightmare. Obviously, because it's not human readable, any human error that's introduced to it isn't going to be caught until you're looking at it in Engine. There's no way to tell just by looking at it that you did something wrong. There's also a lot of steps in generating that where you have to take this mask and put it in that size and then combine it with this other thing in this different value range and then stick it in a channel. It's just too much for a person to handle, obviously, so it's a good candidate for scripting. So that's what we did. Our ideal would be that the texture artists see their final result exactly as it's going to look in game while they're working. It may seem like a bit of a pipe dream to script something out of that and have it turn into that Technicolor nightmare, but our shader is just doing a bunch of compositing operations with masks, right? I mean, it's not like Photoshop sucks at that. So let's just go over what our shader is doing. So we have our luminosity. We're using that to do a lookup into a gradient ramp for both the skin and the cloth. And then we're masking those things. Okay, Photoshop can do all of that. We have a detail texture that we want to mask and then somehow either multiply on or use a mod 2x. That ends up being something like hard light in Photoshop, so obviously we can do that. For the blood, we want to use a solid color. Yep, that's a feature of Photoshop. And then we're going to just mask it onto the rest of those operations, and we get our final diffuse. So that looks like something that Photoshop can handle just fine. Well, the specularities is even simpler. We just paint a specular mask and then use the detail mask to modify what that is. And then our retroreflection is sort of its own thing off on the side there. So all of this looks like it's really possible to do in Photoshop. So what we did was we scripted out a tool that creates an automatic layout in Photoshop of all these different groups. It may look a little scary to begin with, but once I go through it, it'll be pretty obvious that this is easy to work with. What we do is we first create a luminosity. We push everything into the value ranges they need to be pushed into to map to a more complex gradient. For this example, I think there's like 5 different things in the gradient, and so there's a lot of different value ranges in there. We do all of that using levels adjustment layers. We never want to bake that directly into the texture because it would just be a nightmare for iteration. So once we've created the luminosity, we can use the gradient mapping. There are gradient mapping adjustment layers. So we'll just stick a gradient in them that looks like what we would use in game. In this example, you can see that the gradients aren't evenly split. We do that for the same reason that we don't necessarily give the same texel density over the entire mesh. We want to only focus on the areas that players are going to really be scrutinizing. So in this case, because we have only a little bit of texture space given to the safety stripes on the vest that's up in the left-hand corner there, it gets only a little tiny bit of the gradient wrap. That's the little silver bit that's the second in. Actually, I'm going to back up for a sec so I can go over the rest of it. So we have the blood masking and the detail masking, and we author those at full resolution so that they can match up wherever they need to match up with the luminosity. We'll hide the one that we're not working on, show the one that we are. And the specularity is painted in its own layer group, and it's just hidden when we're not working on it. The script is going to go through and grab all of those things, put them in the quadrants they need to be put into, do all of the compositing to create the channels the way they're supposed to be created. We just pop that layer right on top. We keep it around because it's possible just to edit a single channel. And so sometimes, just for speed's sake, if we're just editing the blood mask and then we want to regenerate this texture, we're going to keep the rest of it around. We then compile this PSD directly into a game resource. So let's take a look at one of our guys. So on the left is the texture that got authored, exactly as it appears in Photoshop. And then on the right is the character as it appears in game. And you can see that they're remarkably similar. So we were able to generate a system that allowed artists to see exactly what they would be working on. So this is our zombie model recipe. Add a dash of Eye of Newt. So I think we've seen everything that's on this list so far, except maybe the actual gradient ramps. This ends up being a 16 by 256 texture. It's uncompressed. It's pretty small, so we can afford to do that. When a zombie model is spawned, it picks at random things from each of these categories, and then picks at random a clothing tint and picks at random a cloth tint. The example I showed in the last slide had a pretty complicated gradient. He has his own special map. But for the most part, the Horde is just looking at this one. So that's, like 5 or 6 Horde members, 5 or 6 Horde models and all of their attendant variations are looking at this texture. And the reason that's helpful is because anytime we need to make an overall change to the Horde, whether it be to the saturation or the luminosity or, change the colors a bit to help them fit into their environments better, we can just do it in a single place. So if you've done the math, and I'm sure you have, our simplest model has over 24,000 variations. That's so many variations that we can't even spawn them all without crashing the game. Our levels will use as many as 6 of those, as few as 2. That depends on how much memory we have in a particular map and whether the costuming of those individual models is appropriate to the locale. So here they are doing what zombies do when you're not looking at them. They just loll around. And here's how you normally see them in game, which is rushing at you full force. So this variation has, this map has four models in it. This one's got 5. And the next one I'll show you only has 2 models. Seriously. Yeah. Oh. So at the end of Left 4 Dead 1, we had gone through all of our data and we looked at our systems and seen what we could learn for the next project. The next project happened to be coming up pretty quick, and that was Left 4 Dead 2. But we always, at the end of a project, want to look back at the systems that we use to see what we can learn. So we always measure our success. So let's do the numbers game. Well, we're using 50% less memory than we used for the Horde and Left 4 Dead 1. So that's a really encouraging number. And we're also getting 10 times the variation. And playtesters are telling us that the variation is a lot more visible than the variation we were getting before. So I would almost up that number. In terms of performance in the shaders, in the vertex shader, we added a bunch of instructions. Because we weren't using normal maps, we were able to pull the lighting calculation out of the pixel shader, stuff it into the vertex shader. The great thing about this is the infected Horde is always fill bound. It's never vertex transform bound. And so these 100 instructions are actually pretty much free, so that's kind of rocking. Our pixel shader, we freed up 100 instructions, but then we filled it up again because we were doing all of the compositing. It puts it at a comparable level with Left 4 Dead 1, so it means our performance on the Horde is actually going to be the same, so sweet. Now, we'd asked our playtesters the same thing we asked them in Left 4 Dead 1, which was, what do you recall about the variation in the Horde? Can you remember specific members? And the answer that they gave us was super encouraging because the ones they recalled were actually what we call the uncommon commons. These are guys that have special abilities, and so they have special costuming that's designed to help them stand out so that players can understand that. So from an art standpoint, the ability to make those special variants is really encouraging. On top of that, our creation time is a lot less. Not necessarily because they're easier to author, but because we have to make far less of them. In Left 4 Dead 1, we made something like 32 head textures, and in Left 4 Dead 2, we made 8. So yeah, way more effective, right? So that's how we build the Horde. Let's tear them apart again. So let's talk about some game level goals first before we dive into what we did for Left 4 Dead 1. We want the players to feel as though they are experiencing a zombie apocalypse horror film with their friends. And so there's certain genre expectations that come with that. We want the zombies to feel endless. Well, that's easy. We can just keep spawning them. But we also want to make the players feel as though the zombies are oblivious to hurt. And this comes back to the idea that they're not human anymore. We also think that it's really important to provide feedback appropriate to the type and the level of the weapon that the player is currently using. Because as they play the game and become experienced with it, we want them to be able to make good choices when they're confronted with a new weapon, whether they'd like to swap out or keep the one that they're using, what do their squad members have, and how is that going to change their choices. If they don't understand how powerful a weapon is, or if they don't understand what the advantages or drawbacks of that weapon is, it's really hard for them to make good decisions. In previous Valve titles, we've generally done hit effects through small decals or little blood splurts, but we need to telegraph hurt targets much larger in Left 4 Dead 2 because we have so many of them. We have like 30 zombies that run at you all at once. And so if you're just like shooting into the horde and kind of spraying there, you need to know who you've actually hit because it's going to help you make strategic decisions about where to focus your fire. So in Left 4 Dead 1, the wounds were built in. We actually had to build geometry variations for every single infected that contained each one of these 5 wounds. They're not great for memory. They require texture support. We're spending verts on, his hands and his feet right now just to get that neck in there. They're always fatal, so it doesn't help us with that idea of them being oblivious to hurt. As soon as they're hurt, they're actually already falling out of the player's field of focus because they're dying. So when we were discussing what we'd like to do for this new system, we really wanted to make it easy to add lots of wounds. We sat down, did some brainstorming, but pretty much every idea that we came up with was some variation on, let's create the wounds as separate objects. And then we'll somehow push or cut verts in the sides of the zombie so that we can, pop a wound in there. The geometry level was the place we started, but it turned out not to be good enough because we have this restriction where the tessellation would have to be even. If it's different across 2 Horde members, the whole is going to be different enough that the geometry has to cover that much more area. So we wanted to do it at the pixel level. Now this has its own problems. It looks exactly like what it is. We've taken an ellipsoid volume, we've jammed it into the side of the infected, and everything inside that volume is not going to draw. It doesn't look much like he's wounded. It looks like he's in Maya, and we Booleaned him. So we wanted to try and cover up those edges. This is what we came up with first. We nicknamed them meat flowers because you had these gigantic petal-like constructions of flesh that peel away from the wound. But they end up just moving the seams instead of covering them because they have to match up with the model underneath. So what we decided we'd like to do is just fit the wounds inside the silhouette of the infected. Still cut that hole, but somehow make the seams look better. We thought maybe projecting a texture there and then using that texture to do the cull would be a better idea. So let's try it out. Again, in Maya, using the HLSL shader plugin. So there's my ellipsoid volume. Instead of doing a cull directly, I'm just showing a vertex selection inside that volume. We're going to determine a fall off from that, and that's going to help us limit the effect of our texture projection. The reason we want to limit the effect of the texture projection is sometimes we want the wound just to scoop out the front of him, but not come out the back. So we're going to do the texture projection just along the long axis of that sphere for now. And you can see it combines with the fall off. Only the brightest area of this is going to cull. So there's the brightest bit. Take it out. And then the rest of that is just going to contribute to the blood masking. That fall off is really helpful because we can actually use it alongside that smooth step that we were using on the blood masking before. And we can sort of shrink in the area that is going to be affected by that blood splat. And it depends on the wound, where it appears, and how far that splat should go out. Whoops. No, too far. I really should be using a mouse for this. Here we go. Okay. So that's how we make the hole, and this is what we put in it. We author meshes inside of Maya. That ellipsoid volume is really effectively represented by this stretch sphere and a Boolean. We have this internal anatomy model. We never actually showed this exact model in game, but it's really helpful for us to line up the wounds so they're all internally consistent. We'll take a nerve surface, turn it into a soft body, and use fields to project it onto that internal anatomy model. We'll then project some textures from that anatomy model, do some additional painting and sculpting, and you end up with something that looks like this. We normal map this guy, even though we don't normal map the zombie. We do that because we like the glistening nature of the intestines, and also because because it helps the players think that actually the Horde is higher resolution than they really are. Shh, we're sneaky. So we bind that wound to the same skeleton as the infected, and then when it spawns on him, it inherits his motion. Yes, we saw you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, come on. Okay. So I said at the beginning that it's really important for us to communicate the type and level of the weapon that you're choosing. It's especially important with the melee weapons, and this was proved out in our play tests. So the way the melee weapons sort of work is obviously they're not ranged, so you have to be in range of the infected to be able to use them. When we started this system, we didn't spawn any wounds for them. And so what was happening was players would pick one up. They would try it. Hey, pretty cool. I got a frying pan, go bonk on the top of the head of an infected. But what was happening is they would realize that they were at risk because they were using this weapon, because they were in range of the infected. And they didn't see any advantage. Now, the truth is these weapons are actually incredibly powerful. You can hold back a number of infected with them because they have an area of effect. And also, they're usually one-hit kills. But because we didn't have that wound feedback on the infected, players just weren't seeing it. So they would pick up the weapon, use it for a bit, it's a bit of a novelty, but then they would just put it down and go back to their guns. Originally, we had tried adding the wounds just using that same round shape that you saw in the previous slide. That shape is it's good for things like shotgun wounds, but it's not great for slashing wounds. We tried just compressing the ellipsoid into a disc, but that ended up not being super helpful because the texture was obviously stretched and it looked like a bug. So we added a new shape to the cull. And this is the resulting game. We also pick the wounds according to how you're swinging the weapon. So the ones that are through the meaty areas of the body are actually chosen according to the direction of the swing. So we created a bunch of them in this kind of star-shaped pattern. Oh no, he can't walk. And there you can see you can affect multiple infected at the same time with your weapon. So once we added that system in, players were understanding the trade-offs of the weapons much better. And so you would end up with squad members that would be like, okay, I'll be the axe guy this time, and I'll hold them back from the door while you guys are healing. And they would pick up those weapons and use them for the entire campaign. The drawbacks of this technique are, it's pretty obvious. We're doing a planar projection onto a curved surface. We're going to get some texture stretching. But because we're doing these blood splats and just like buckets of blood everywhere, players were usually just seeing that stretching as just a long splatter. So it really didn't make that much of a difference. The advantages are that the wounds are stackable. And by that I mean that we can have multiple wounds on the same mesh. So you can have that guy that's coming at you, he's trying to hit you, you blow off his arm, he's got his little arm nub trying to smack you with it, and you can blow a hole through his torso. And that's great because it communicates the unstoppable nature of them. They're really not afraid to be hurt. So the wounds are really easy to iterate because you can just change the mesh in one spot and it distributes to the entire horde. And we have no extra mesh data to store. So in the next steps, we wanted to really communicate the damage that is done by the really powerful weapons like the grenade launcher and the pipe bomb. I think I'm running out of time. Is that so? You guys like that? So you're seeing you're seeing the build in developer mode right now. He doesn't know he's wounded. We've just activated the graphical portion of it. This next guy's even better. He's missing a leg, but he still runs at you. So you can see dropping away from there are we call them gibs. It's short for giblets. And they're just there to communicate that the masses are preserved. We only authored one set of them, and they're the same for all the infected, this kind of medium brown unclothed. Yeah, he's my favorite. Just pants coming at you. And here's the pipe bomb effect. So you can see it's obvious this is an extremely powerful weapon. I was going to go on, but I'll let it play through because you're obviously enjoying it. Oh, gross. Okay. Nice. Okay. So when it comes to actually spawning these things in game, that Boolean that you saw in that original video when we were authoring things, just that sphere that was placed, that's actually not just a stand-in for the ellipsoid volume that we're going to use for the cull. It's like the perfect thing to use to get that data from. So what we do is we use MeltScript just to dump out its transform, and then we use that directly in game. We also have wounds that don't work together. So if you cut an infected here, and you get a little nub there, you don't want to also cut them here and get another nub there, and then this one's floating out in space. So we have exclusion lists of wounds that don't work together. We can also use the data file that contains the Boolean transform information and the exclusion lists and put in attachment points for particle systems and define what those particle systems are. So the artists are in control of things like when you do the groin shot, you get that ribbon trail of entrails. And when you do the headshot, you get that geyser of blood. It also controls which giblets spawn at which point. So if you take off half the infected, it's going to have a set of them that it will spawn. And we also have weapon restrictions in this data file. You obviously don't want to create a slash wound with the shotgun. That would be kind of ridiculous. But on top of just having a normal weapon restriction, we can also have damage thresholds. So the infected is actually broken down into a bunch of hitboxes that roughly map to a skeleton, sometimes a little more finely depending on what effects we're trying to achieve. And those hitboxes have a variety of wounds that can be spawned from them. If you're using the chainsaw and you just nick a guy through the torso hitbox is going to realize how much damage you've done, and it'll spawn a slash wound. But if you take the chainsaw and you really go at him, you're going to end up with a half wound because you've done that much more damage. So we're at the point now where the wound system is finished, it's complete, it's in game. We need to look back and see what we did right and what we did wrong. So in the first Left 4 Dead, we had 5 wounds. In Left 4 Dead 2, we have 54. We have a set each for the males and the females because their proportions are different enough that the content needed to change. Because we have multiple wounds that we can put on each of the infected, you can actually kill a zombie in 768 different ways instead of just 5. Each wound is only 13% of the cost in the old system. That's including both textures and vertices, so that's pretty good savings right there. For vertex shader performance, we're using another 15 instructions. Again, we're still fill bound, so these instructions are pretty much free. The pixel shader gets 7 more instructions. I don't really care. So the Horde and the wound system together are actually 1.5 times as expensive as the system in Left 4 Dead 1. We were shooting for parity or below, but the important thing to note at this juncture is that the memory used on the wounds is actually linear. If we'd wanted to reach parity, we could have cut half of our variants without scrapping the system, and we would have been fine. Something else happened late in the project. We had a savior charge in on his white horse, changed the way that vertices were compressed on Xbox 360, and so we got to keep them. The playtesters loved it. It improved the player satisfaction with the melee weapons to the point that it almost saved the system. And it also made initial creation time and iteration time so much quicker that we could make those 54 wounds. It actually was 108 across both the males and the females. So when we asked ourselves at the beginning of the project, how can we do more with less, we had an inkling that we could trade some memory for computation, rearrange our content so it fits a smaller footprint, and then reconstitute it in our shaders. What we didn't realize was by doing that, by breaking down our content, we were also going to make creation time quicker, which is intensely valuable because we had that year-long schedule. And the result was that we were able to make a bigger, better Left 4 Dead 2. C'est fini. I know I talked a little long. I'm always guilty of overshare when it comes to information about games that we make. But we have a little bit of time for questions. So if anybody has any, could you please come up to the microphone? And if there's no time left and we get kicked out, you can just talk to me. I'll be up here.
You mentioned 7 more pixel shader instructions. Do you know offhand your total instruction counts for vertex and pixel shaders on the Xbox 360?
Oh, gosh, I had that number. I think it was somewhere around 135 without wounds, and then just over 140 with in the pixel shader. Don't quote me, though. I can look it up and send it to you. Really? No more questions? Wow, I did awesome and answered everything.
I'll give you one, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
The UV projection you were talking about in regards to the wounds, is that like a camera space projection at the time of impact or something? Or is that
No,
done
it's
on
not.
August side?
It's not dynamic at all. It's
okay.
all pre-baked.
Gotcha.
So I had that ellipsoid, and I was just lining it up to show you guys how the projection was happening. But actually, it just goes along one of the axes of the ellipsoid, and that can be oriented any way that the content creator needs it to be made. And so for the shoulder, I think it's a straight through, but then for the head, it's like angled slightly upwards. It just depends on where it is on the mesh.
And then the other question would be like body sizes. Is there anything you had to do with, like, you couldn't do certain body sizes because you had to do wounds that worked over everybody? Or? We
could not. So when we were talking about the variation, we knew right at the beginning that if we were changing body proportion, that was going to help a lot. But because we were developing the wound system at the same time, we realized if we did that, we were really shooting ourselves in the foot for the footprint of the wounds. Because we're pre-making these things, if we had to do them for all these different body types, it wouldn't have been, 108. It would have been like 900, and then we would have really killed our memory. And so we made a decision to limit the proportion of the infected so that we could just use a single set. Anybody else? All right then. Thanks, guys.